Chapter 6: The Early History of the Nile Valley. Tesseti Civilization. Ancient Egypt is the first major civilization in Africa for which records are abundant. It was not, however, Africa's first kingdom. On the 1st of March, 1979, the New York Times carried an article on its front page and also page 16, written by Boyce Rensberger, that was entitled Nubian Monarchy Called Oldest. In the article, we were assured that evidence of the oldest recognizable monarchy in human history, preceding the rise of the earliest Egyptian kings by several generations, has been discovered in artifacts from ancient Nubia. The discovery is expected to stimulate a new appraisal of the origins of civilization in Africa, raising the question of to what extent later Egyptian culture derived its advanced political structure from the Nubians. This ancient kingdom, generally called Tesseti, encompassed the territory of the northern Sudan and the southern portion of Egypt. It has sometimes been referred to as ancient Ethiopia in some of the literature and as Kush or Kush in other literature. It was the first known society on earth to have evolved through the stages described by Count de Valnay to civilization. Mr. Rensberger explained that the discovery of this lost kingdom was based on interpreting artifacts from long-lost tombs excavated in 1962. An international archaeological campaign headed by Keith C. Seal, a professor at the University of Chicago, uncovered the remains from a graveyard. The archaeologists worked quickly to rescue the deposits before the rising waters of the Aswan Dam covered them forever. The cemetery was located in the ancient city of Kustal, or the Nile, near the modern boundary between Sudan and Egypt. It was found to contain 33 tombs. The importance of these artifacts, however, were unappreciated until relatively recently. They were kept in storage at the university's Oriental Institute. In 1978, Bruce Williams, a research associate at this institution, made a systematic study of the finds and demonstrated their great importance. From noticing the quantity and quality of the painted pottery and the jewelry, Bruce Williams concluded that the buried individuals were distinguished. Just how distinguished was answered by an incense burner. This artifact depicts a crowned individual together with a palace facade, a royal ship, and a falcon totem, all symbols of royalty. Dr. Williams was unable to name the crowned king. He could confirm, however, that this royal personage ruled 3 generations before the first known Egyptian ruler, King Scorpion. Apparently, Nubia had writing at this early time, to cite Rensberger. Bruce Williams said some of the Nubian artifacts bore disconnected symbols resembling those of Egyptian hieroglyphics that were not readable. They were on their way to literacy, Dr. Williams said, probably quite close to Egypt in this respect. Mr. Rensberger's splendid article closes with the following intelligence. A detailed monograph on the discovery is in preparation, but there is no deadline and publication is expected to be a few years away. A year later, Bruce Williams delivered. He published a valuable paper on his discoveries in Archaeology Magazine, Volume 33, Number 5, 1980. The article was entitled The Lost Pharaohs of Nubia, from which we have extracted the following. A newly discovered kingdom is always a matter of intense interest, but when it precedes the earliest known monarchy, the unification of Egypt, then history itself is reborn. The place is ancient Nubia at Kustal, where the investigation of archaeological materials recovered during the great 1960s rescue effort has recently unveiled a birthplace of pharaonic civilization several generations before the rise of the first historic Egyptian dynasty. In 1962, an archaeological team set out to unearth ancient remains before the newly built Aswan Dam flooded the sites. Professor Keith C. Seal led the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute Nubian expedition. His team excavated an area of Kustal near the river. Towards the end of their campaign, they found a cemetery consisting of A group, northern Nubian tombs. These tombs were as large as those of Egyptian pharaohs Narmer and Ka from the Egyptian city of Abydos. Recognizing the importance of this site, Professor Seal named it Cemetery L. From this graveyard, over 1,000 painted pots, many of fine quality, were retrieved. Some were complete, but others had long since fragmented. The pottery represented 5 styles of decoration or manufacture. 3 of these styles were of Sudanese or lower, i.e. northern Nubian origins. Also represented were vessels of Syro-Palestinian origins. Most of the foreign pottery, however, came from Egypt. Of Egyptian manufacture were miniature flasks, narrow-necked bottles, jars, cylindrical and spouted, and also large storage jars, 4 of the storage jars were incised with inscriptions that clearly represent an early form of hieroglyphic writing. Dr. Williams demonstrates that the writing was partly an Egyptian and partly a Nubian development. The fragments of art and writing in Cemetery L parallel most of the developments of late Naqada civilization in Egypt. Enough of them are of local materials, are local type objects, or of such a nature that an Egyptian origin is precluded. The marks, inscriptions, and representations incised on pottery include simple marks made for the control of production or transportation. Except for the inscription of Pihor, major writing groups incised before firing were of Egyptian origin, but a number of stereotype symbols incised after firing do not occur in Egyptian pot marks, i.e. they are Nubian origin. The only comment that needs to be added is that Dr. Williams may be incorrect to assume a part Egyptian origin for the development of writing. This point will be discussed later. Aside from the pottery, a startling variety of objects were excavated. Gold was found in 5 of the tombs. As well as golden bracelet, there was a necklace consisting of a golden pendant shaped like a fly connected to gold sheet beads. We note that its appearance reminds us of the later Egyptian military decoration, the Order of the Fly. There were copper artifacts. These included mace heads, spearheads, rings, a copper tray, and a copper cap for a furniture leg. There were artifacts of ivory. These included ivory spoons and gaming pieces. Incidentally, gaming boards were also recovered. There were art pieces of great naturalism. There were hippopotami fashioned in terracotta and limestone. There were mortars and pestles and also palettes, highly polished, made of colored quartz. They were used to grind malachite for application as eye paint. Moreover, high-quality jewelry was recovered, including finely crafted pieces of amethyst, carnelian, faience, and rock crystal. Finally, there were 100 stone vessels and more than 4,000 other objects made from seashells. With this level of wealth surviving after millennia of plundering, it was not difficult to see why Dr. Williams inferred that the range of these and other fragments from the plundered cemetery began to indicate a wealth and complexity that could only be called royal. In one of the earliest tombs, a Horus incense burner was unearthed incised with symbols similar to those of Egyptian royalty but predating Egypt. The incisions, though stylized, depict an important personage sitting in a boat. Dr. Williams explains that. Although the figure in the middle ship is almost completely destroyed, the white crown, supposedly of Upper Egypt, clearly stands out above the ship. In front of it is the tail of the falcon, another sign of kingship. The crown indicates that the figure is a king. In front of the falcon is a rosette, a symbol of royalty before the first dynasty of Egypt. The early date of Custal incense burner is further reflected by other figures that have connections to Middle and later pre-dynastic Egyptian art. An unnamed feline deity, a man saluting in a pose and style typical of Naqada II vase painting, and 2 animals, an antelope and carnivore, cavorting around the central royal ship. They pose in characteristic manner of early Egyptian palettes, which show groups of struggling animals. This type precedes those with scenes of historical events, i.e., it is prehistoric or pre-Egyptian First Dynasty. Its date, provided by context, style, and composition, the Custal burner furnishes the earliest definite representation of a king in the Nile Valley or anywhere. On this evidence, Bruce Williams concluded that the ruler depicted above is the first attested king in the world history. There existed, however, earlier archaeological evidence that had been known about for nearly a century. This data could have been used long ago to produce the same conclusion. Pre-dynastic tombs excavated in Salaya show that the Nubian elite were buried with a rich collection of goods. These included copper ingots, axes of copper, huge bird-shaped pallets, and 2 huge maces with golden handles. According to a modern scholar, one of these mace heads was a superlative object and would have been a prized possession in the treasury of an Egyptian king. In fact, hardly anything quite so fine has been recovered from Egypt of the same period. Dr. Williams interprets other evidence from Salaya, i.e. Siali, that Tasseti was a territorial state, the first such state to be established in history. A seal impression found in an A-group storage cache in Siali, far to the north of Custal, has a concentric syrinx surmounted by familiar falcon symbol. There are also representations of incense burners in use, D-shaped altars or pylons associated with the Hebsed festival, the jubilee celebrated by a pharaoh first in his 30th year, and periodically thereafter, and a man seated in a chair saluting the bow symbol. The bow hovers over a shortened rectangle which in this period represents land. The obvious interpretation is that the man is saluting the name of Nubia. Seti, or Land of the Bow, as a kingship and territorial state. The range of pottery in the tombs offers evidence of trading links. Seti traded goods with lands to the south, with Egypt and also 1,000 miles away in the Middle East. The copper artifacts, including the cap for the furniture leg, the jewelry of gold or precious stones, the ivory spoons, and the quartz palettes, all give clues to some of the industries in Seti. The ships, with their tall sterns and bent prows, gives an indication of how trade over such distances could well have been conducted. The gaming pieces give some clues to some of their recreational activities. Incense burning is usually associated with religious activities. Bruce Williams writes that the presence of Horus emphasizes the development of official religion at Custal, of a type later characteristic of a dynastic Egypt. Horus is generally associated with the ancient Egyptian religion. He is portrayed as a god or saint and is sometimes depicted as a falcon in the iconography. The coastal evidence shows that the Horus story came from Nubia and was only inherited by the Egyptians. Interestingly, an Egyptian text, which may well date from the 3rd dynasty, makes the same point. The Edfu text, says Professor Jackson, is an important source document on the early history of the Nile Valley. This famous inscription found in the Temple of Horus at Edfu gives an account of the origin of Egyptian civilization. According to this record, civilization was brought from the south, i.e. Nubia, by a band of invaders under the leadership of King Horus. This ruler, Horus, was later defied and ultimately became the Egyptian Christ. The Greeks, towards the end of ancient Egyptian history, restored the Temple of Horus. The Greeks, however, maintained the authenticity of the original monument, as Professor Breasted explains. The priests who conducted the rebuilding at Edfu under the Ptolemies, i.e. the Greek rulers of Egypt, claimed to be reproducing the structure formerly erected thereafter, the plans of Imhotep, i.e. a 3rd dynasty prime minister. The other key god or saint in the Egyptian religion was Osiris. His worship would also seem to have originated in Nubia. Dr. Williams offers evidence that suggests that Hebsed festival was performed in Seti. Sir Flinders Petrie, the great British Egyptologist, wrote that this festival was performed to identify the king of Osiris. Diodorus Siculus, the noted Greek historian, recorded the Ethiopians, i.e. Nubians, who had come from the south initially peopled Egypt, Osiris having been the leader of the colony. Diodorus further affirms that the historians of his time say that the Ethiopians were the first to be taught to honor the gods and to hold sacrifices and processions and festivals and the other rites by which men honor the deity, and that in the consequence their piety has been published abroad among all men, and is generally held that the sacrifices practiced among the Ethiopians are those most pleasing to heaven. As witness to this, they call upon the poet who was perhaps the oldest and certainly most venerated among the Greeks, i.e. Homer. For in the Iliad, he represents both Zeus and the rest of the gods with him as absent on the visit of Ethiopia, i.e. Nubia, to share in the sacrifices and the banquet which were given annually by Ethiopians for all gods. The notion that Osiris came from Nubia is also supported by an Egyptian religious text called the Laden Papyrus. In this text we read the following: I looked out before to observe Osiris the Ethiopian. The original Egyptian word given as Ethiopian in the translation is Kis, or Cush. Therefore, the sentence is more accurately rendered as, I looked out before to observe Osiris the Cushite. Cush, Ethiopia, and Nubia are, of course, nearly synonymous, as generally refer to the same territory that was to the south of ancient Egypt. Professor Amelinu was one of the early pioneers in archaeology. He also taught history and religion in Paris. He concurs with the above ideas contained in the Laden Papyrus and adds that Set and Isis were also of Nubian origins. If Osiris was of a Nubian origin, it would be easy to understand why the struggle between Set and Horus took place in Nubia. In any case, it is striking that the goddess Isis, according to the legend, has precisely the same skin color that Nubians always have, and that the god Osiris has what seems to me an ethnic epithet indicating his Nubian origin. Sir E. A. Wallace Budge, Britain's greatest Egyptologist of all times, noted that Amun-Ra, Shu, Tefnut, Hathor, and Nut, other Egyptian gods, goddesses, or saints, were also of Nubian origins. From the hymn of Amun-Ra, translated by Budge, we read the following: The gods love the smell of him when he, the eldest born of the dew, cometh from Punt, i.e. Somalia or Ethiopia. When he traversed the land of the Machel, i.e. Nubia, the beautiful face coming from the land of the god, i.e. the southeastern Sudan. Concerning Shu, Tefnut, and Hathor, Budge informs us that these forms of Ra were Shu. Tefnut, Keb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Now Shu and Tefnut were Sudani, i.e. Nubian deities, the original seat of whose worship was Bukum, a country in the eastern Sudan, and they were introduced into Egypt in very early times with the worship of the Sudani cow goddess Hathor. At this point, he adds that, from an inscription published by Bruch, we see plainly that Shu and Tefnut were gods of Sudani or Nubian origin, and that their worship was introduced into the island of Senmut in the First Cataract from the south. Concerning Nut, he notes that in one representation she has a Sudani crown of plumes on her head and wears armlets and bracelets. Finally, Mr. J. A. Rogers, the pioneering Jamaican researcher, points out that, according to Sir E. A. W. Budge and others, most of the earliest Egyptian gods, such as Ta, father of the gods, and Bes, god of war, mischief, and comedy, originated in the Sudan. The Custal incense burners offers a clue to the royal architecture of Tesseti. Professor Diop in the Civilization or Barbarism noticed that the palace Serek, incised on the incense burner, resembles part of the outer wall of a famous Egyptian monument of the Third Dynasty that is still extant. This monument, known as Funerary Complex of Saqqara, has an entrance that seems to have taken its design directly or indirectly from the Serek idea. See page 161. This indicates that the palaces of Tesseti may have partly resembled the Saqqara complex. Returning to the research of Bruce Williams, he wrote that the continued re-evaluation of the Custal objects began to indicate a sequence that led, generation by generation, from Cemetery L to the time of the last pre-First Dynasty tombs at Abydos. The dating of this period, however, is controversial. Cemetery L contains the tombs of 12 pharaohs ruling over the 9 generations. Bruce Williams believes that the dating of the first pharaoh can only be accomplished in relation to the First Dynasty of Egypt. He believes that the 12 kings ruled for a total period of 300 years, most of which elapsed before the First Dynasty. This is not a fixed date, but is relative to and dependent on the chronology accepted for the dating of ancient Egypt. We date the first Nubian kings to around 5900 BC. Our justification for this dating will be given in Chapter 8. Dr. Williams found that 3 generations of pharaohs ruled Tesseti as the only attested kings on earth. During the 4th generation, a Tesseti pharaoh successfully marched against Hirokinopolis in Egypt. This was the earliest known recorded event in world history. A storage jar at Custal attests to this victorious campaign. Furthermore, there is an A group, i.e. Nubian tomb in Hirokinopolis, of royal size and design, adding further substance to a Nubian conquest. The Gebel Sheikh Suleiman monument boasts of other military victories over the Egyptians. Another bull from Custal records Nubian campaigns against Ta Shemo, Upper Egypt against Ta Jeme, Libya. During the time of the 5th generation of Nubian rulers, Upper Egypt may have united and became a greater threat to Tesseti. But by the period of the 7th generation Nubian pharaoh, an important line of kings ruled in the Upper, i.e. southern Egypt. These kings were buried at Abydos, the sacred city of the Egyptians. With the rise of the Egyptian First Dynasty, Pharaoh Oraha, its second pharaoh, 5598 to 5581 BC, campaigned against Tesseti's 9th generation pharaoh. Oraha's campaign destroyed the Nubian kingdom. At a much later date, Dr. Williams believes that the fleeing Nubians created the Kerma culture much further south. See pages 174 to 176. Richard Poe, author of Black Spark, White Fire, introduces a new archaeological evidence that he feels undermines or modifies the data that Bruce Williams has presented. An impressive royal tomb, says Poe, was excavated. For example, near the upper Egyptian city of Abydos, the early date of the tomb, which appears to have been roughly contemporary with the Custal incense burner, increases the probability that Egyptian and Nubian monarchies may have evolved at roughly the same time. Anthropological data, however, places this evidence into a very different light. Tracy L. Prowse and Nancy C. Lovell of the University of Alberta in Canada wrote a useful paper entitled Concordance of Cranial and Dental Morphological Traits and Evidence for Endogamy in Ancient Egypt. The abstract to this document reads as follows. A biological affinity study based on frequencies of cranial non-metric traits in skeletal samples from 3 cemeteries at pre-dynastic Naqada, Egypt, confirms the results of recent non-metric dental morphological analysis. Both cranial and dental traits analysis indicate that the individuals buried in cemetery characterized archaeologically as high status or significantly different from the individuals buried in two other, apparently non-elite cemeteries, that the non-elite samples are not significantly different from each other. A comparison with neighboring Nile Valley skeletal samples suggests that the high-status cemetery represents an endogamous ruling or elite segment of the local population of Naqada, which is more closely related to the populations in northern Nubia than to the neighboring populations in southern Egypt. This evidence indicates that the elites of upper, i.e. southern Egypt, at this early date, in contrast to the commoners, were in fact Nubians. Moreover, the Nubian elite buried in Naqada intermarried with others from Nubia and not with the upper Egyptians. This may well show the royal tomb referred to by Poe belonged to a Nubian elite personage, or if Egyptian, its existence was sanctioned by the Nubian elite. The Abydos tomb, therefore, is unlikely to undermine nor significantly modify the Williams data. On the other hand, Prowse and Lovell's evidence may indicate that developments in the Egyptian city of Naqada were due to the influence exerted by the Nubian elite. One of these developments, as Dr. Williams explained, was the birth of writing. It may well turn out that the birth of writing was entirely a Nubian accomplishment, contrary to Williams, who believed that it was partly a Nubian and partly an Egyptian accomplishment. In closing, the archaeological evidence lends great support to what the classical writers had said all along. Stephanus of Byzantium, writing in the 5th century AD, for example, accurately recorded that Ethiopia, i.e. Nubia, was the first established country on earth, and the Ethiopians were the first to set up the worship of the gods and who established laws. Dr. Williams penned a good summary on the importance of the Tesseti achievement that we have reproduced as follows. For 9 generations or more, according to the sequence of tombs of Cemetery L, some 12 kings of Custal participated with other kings in Upper Egypt in the creation of a unified culture. For Egypt, they helped fashion pharaonic civilization and thus a legacy for the first dynasty, which the world has marveled at for millennia. For Nubia, they established an early political unity and led the country to the first cultural distinction. Old Kingdom Egypt. Ancient Egypt was entirely dependent on the river Nile for its very existence. This was so much the case that the Egyptians had deeply held belief that the Nubians could, in theory, bring them to their knees by diverting its course. The Nile flows from the Lake Victoria in present-day Uganda, north through the Sudan, and ultimately through Egypt. Along the way, the river passes through 6 naturally occurring geographical markers called cataracts. By tradition, scholars call the First Cataract, which is also the most southerly, number 6. In addition, they call the last one, also the most northerly, number 1. Professor Yosef Ben Yochanan, an Ethiopian Egyptologist, long proposed abandoning this strange tradition, but his ideas have not caught on as yet. In this chapter, we use the traditional numbering, though we are well aware that it is perverse. After a trek of 3,400 miles, the Nile reaches the Egyptian Nile Valley, which stretches 650 miles through the desert. For the last 100 miles of the Nile's journey, the river divides. It fans out before emptying into the Mediterranean. These swamplands of northern Egypt are also called the Delta, a Greek name referring to the Greek letter delta or D. This letter is written as a triangle. The swamplands received this name because the river subdividing on a map looks triangular. See map on page 149. Once every year, the Nile River overflows. In Ethiopia, monsoon rains flood the banks of the Nile. As the Nile flows from south to north, rich soils are carried along the river, which are eventually deposited in Egypt. Bringing great fertility to the land, these soils made Egypt one of the most fertile places on earth. The Nile dominated every aspect of Egyptian life. Their calendar was divided into 3 agricultural seasons based on the annual flooding. The first season was called Endogamy, the time of the summer floods. During this period, the Egyptians could be employed on construction projects since there was no agricultural work for them to do. There was another season called Emergence, where crops could be planted as the water receded. Finally, there was a season of the dry time, where it was possible to harvest. The Nile year was 12 months long, each month consisting of 30 days. They added 5 festival days at the end of the year to complete the 365-day cycle. The government levied taxes according to the height of the Nile during the inundation. The inundation affected the amount of land that could be watered and fertilized by the Nile. Herodotus, the Greek historian, claimed that the annual flooding of the Nile made Egypt so fertile that very little farming effort was required to reap such bountiful crops. Manetho, an Egyptian priest, wrote a history of Egypt towards the very end of the ancient Egyptian period. He divided the history of the pharaohs into 30 dynasties. Unfortunately, this great work is now lost. What is known about it today comes from experts that later writers have quoted, such as Africanus and Eusebius. There are, however, other records of Egyptian history. The Temple of Pharaoh Seti I, ruled 1450 to 1395 BC, dedicated to Osiris, the Egyptian god of death and resurrection, contains a special hall of the ancestors. 75 royal ancestors were listed there in chronological order. There are other sources from similar temples that are of great importance in the reconstruction of Egyptian history. Geographically, Egypt was divided into two, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Each had its own capital city. The southern part of Egypt, from the First Cataract of the Nile to the region now known as Cairo, was called Upper Egypt. Nekhen, also called Hirokinopolis, was its greatest early city. The Nile flows further north from Cairo to the Mediterranean. This northern region is called Lower Egypt. Budo was its greatest early city. Each of the two lands had their own heraldic flowers, crowns, kingly titles, demigods, and goddesses. Each land was unified in the person of the ruler. Upper Egypt was the land of the lotus flower, whose rulers wore the white crown. The Upper Egyptians believed that Nekhbet, the vulture goddess, protected their land. Lower Egypt was the land of the papyrus plant, whose rulers wore the red crown. The Lower Egyptians believed that the Wadjet, the snake goddess, protected their land. Both crowns, however, had a very different origin. The white crown of Upper Egypt made its earliest known appearance on the heads of the Tseti pharaohs, as we have already seen. The red crown of Lower Egypt made its earliest known appearance on an Upper Egyptian artifact from the city of Naqada. We believe this shows the powerful influence of the Tseti on early Egypt. Hirokinopolis, the capital of Upper Egypt, was the city of Horus, the falcon deity. Archaeologists discovered it over 100 years ago and have systematically studied it. In 1978, scholars found that it existed 400 years before the first Egyptian dynasty. The city stretched for over 2 miles along the edge of a plain. Containing many neighborhoods, its population included skilled people such as craftsmen, farmers, officials, and potters. Of particular interest was a house and workshop that once belonged to a potter who made cooking pots for his neighbors. Fragments of 300,000 pots were found in the vicinity. On the north side of town was located in the industrial zone. One of the things produced there was beer. The brewery could well have served the needs of 200 people per day. Also discovered was Egypt's first known temple. The Temple of Horus had a large oval courtyard. In its midst stood a pole with a large image of Horus the falcon. Adjacent to the courtyard was a 3-room shrine, whose facade was made up of 4 huge timber pillars, 20 feet high. Covering the walls was lavish colored mats. The shrine dominated both the temple complex and the central part of the city. Buto was the capital of Lower Egypt. Archaeological excavations in 1983 showed that the city was very ancient and was occupied for over 500 years. The early pottery found there seems to have been influenced from models coming from the Middle East. The later pottery was of an indigenous Upper Egyptian style. As in Upper Egypt, the early houses in this region were made of mud bricks. The earliest king of unified Egypt was Mena, from the Upper Egyptian city of Thinis. Different historians of antiquity quote Manetho as saying slightly different things about the great monarch. Africanus, however, quotes Manetho as saying that Mena reigned 62 years. Herodotus, the excellent Greek historian of antiquity, collected other information on this king during his visit to the country. The Egyptian priest said that Men, i.e. Mena, was the first king of Egypt, and that it was he who raised the dike which protects Memphis from the inundations of the Nile. Before his time, the river flowed entirely through the sandy range of hills which skirts Egypt on the side of Libya. He, however, by banking up the river at the bend, which it forms about 100 furlongs south of Memphis, laid the ancient channel dry, while he dug a new course for the stream halfway between the 2 lines of hills. Besides these works, he also, the priest said, built the Temple of Volcan, i.e. Ta, which stands within the city, i.e. Herodotus' time, a vast edifice very worthy of mention. There is a famous palette associated with the Egyptian king called Narmer. Most historians believe that he is the same person as Mena. This document, exquisitely carved, shows the king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, and he stands with his arm raised holding a mace, just about to strike an enemy. On the other side of the palette, the king is seen wearing the red crown of the Lower Egypt. He is in procession with the company of high officials. This document shows that the king has defeated the rulers of Lower Egypt. On the palate are lions with serpent-like heads intertwined, symbolizing unification. From this date onwards, the kings of Egypt wore the double crown, the white and the red crown combined. He was thus the first king to take the title of the two ladies, referring to the goddesses Nekbet and Wadjet. Finally, Mena led expeditions southeast to the mountain regions where the stone quarries stood. From here, building materials were obtained. The city of Abydos was important. The kings of the first two dynasties of the Old Kingdom were buried there. The research in 1988 showed that an even earlier dynasty reigned in Abydos. Of the many discoveries was an elaborate tomb lined with bricks. The tomb had 12 rooms with doors and windows, resembling a palace in almost every way. In the palace was an ivory scepter that demonstrates the incumbent was a king. Some scholars call this period Dynasty Zero. During this period, the ancient Egyptians, and for that matter, the Nubians, developed writing. This script is the famous hieroglyphic system. Some of the documents from the tomb contain place names that existed in Lower Egypt. Scholars interpret this evidence that the Lower Egyptians paid taxes and tribute to these early rulers of Abydos. Also found were wine jars brought in from Canaan. King Scorpion was the great ruler from this period. Out of the unification of the two lands emerged the new capital city of Memphis. This city was also called the White Walls, probably in reference to the walls that surrounded the royal palace. Memphis was also called the balance of the two lands. The period from Mena to the end of the Sixth Dynasty is called the Old Kingdom. During this period, the Egyptians built the Great Pyramids, wrote the pyramid texts, and pioneered the solar calendar. There is much controversy surrounding the actual dating of this period, however. Egyptian records, documented by Manetho and cited by Julius Africanus, gave the beginning of the Old Kingdom period as 5717 BC. Some contemporary scholars, for no good reason, prefer the Berlin chronology of Professor Edward Meyer. He dates the beginning of the Old Kingdom period as 3180 BC. Meyer had, in effect, erased 2,500 years of African history with the stroke of a pen. His chronology has become the standard one used by Egyptologists through the dominance of the Oriental Institute in the world of Egyptology founded by Meyer's disciple, James Henry Breasted. Their chronology is supported by no records whatsoever and actually contradicts those records. Since history must be based on the available documentation, we follow the Professor Jackson in using the Manetho Africanus chronology, as modified and corrected by the Scottish Orientalist Duncan MacNaughton. We do, however, have minor disagreements with this scholar, but we accept his basic edifice. We date the ascension of Narmer Mena at 5660 BC. We present a fuller discussion of Egyptian chronology in Chapter 8. In 5598 BC, Orha succeeded Mena. During this time, there were trade links with Lebanon and Syria. Coniferous timber was obtained from these countries that were used in building projects. Oraha built a castle in Memphis and also its first tomb. Gargantuan in size, it was constructed of sun-dried bricks and had 5 underground rooms carved out of the rock. In Abydos, the religious capital, he built a false tomb. Later kings would do likewise. According to Michael Rice, an able English historian, the monumental tombs of the First Dynasty are, by any standards, very remarkable buildings. Another important development from the period was the evolution of hieratic, i.e. cursive writing, written on papyrus. Of the few tidbits of the information that has come down to us specifically on the king, it is recorded that he visited the sanctuary of the goddess Neith in Lower Egypt and had a divine statue of her carved. Despite this piety, however, he ordered military campaigns. Orha led a devastating raid on Tesseti, ending its dynasty and closing a chapter in African history. Jur, the next ruler, held sway in Nubia as far south as the Second Cataract. He also campaigned against the Libyans at the edge of the delta. In addition, later traditions claim that the Jur period was one where the sciences flourished. Apparently, Jur wrote books on anatomy and medicine himself that were still popular thousands of years later. A treatment for baldness was among his achievements. Important physical remains survive from Jur's time that demonstrates the sumptuousness of the king's accoutrements and the opulence of his court. In Saqqara stands the extensive building 56 meters long and 24 wide, surrounded by 300 bulls' heads with horns, finely sculpted of clay. Originally inlaid with strips of gold plating, the central chamber consisted of a room with wooden panels. Inside were found a wealth of copper vessels, tools, weapons, and fine gold-handled knife. Finally, from his Abydos tomb, a stunning collection of jewels were recovered, still attached to a human arm. Pharaoh Merenith, his successor, was the first woman in history to run a country in her own right. Jet, the next ruler, is known primarily for the artistic merits of his tomb Stella, now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Above all else, says Mr. Rice, what Jet's Stella demonstrates is restraint, exceptional refinement, and an understanding of a form which is not to be repeated by artists of other nationalities until the coming of the Greeks. Even then, the Greeks hardly ever achieved the monumental simplicity that the unknown master of the Stela of the King Jet produced with such divine assurance. Den succeeded Jet on the throne in around 5476 BC. Like Jur, he had a medical background. Medical studies on bone fractures carried out during his reign were quoted in much later Egyptian medical documents. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, now housed in New York Academy of Medicine, is one of the 10 surviving ancient Egyptian medical texts. The text gives an account of 48 cases of bone surgery and of external pathology. The text demonstrates a detailed knowledge of anatomy, gives remarkably accurate descriptions of traumatic surgical lesions, and describes their treatments where applicable. Professor Sheikh Anta Diop, the great Senegalese Egyptologist, informs us that its scientific conciseness was won with admiration of modern scientists. The papyrus, though written during the 18th Egyptian dynasty, is a copy of a much older Egyptian text from this period. The 18th dynasty copyist was forced to include glossaries for the readers because the original language nearly 3,000 years earlier was just too archaic. The meanings had become impenetrable. What has survived, however, is only 1/3 of the original manuscripts that stops at the 48th case. Consequently, it deals only with the skeleton and soft tissue parts of the head and neck, the upper portion of the body. The original was probably a complete manual of traumatic surgery covering all of the body. Each of the 48 surviving cases is written out as 1. An examination, 2. A diagnosis, 3. A treatment, 4. And finally, glossaries to explain the First Dynasty language to the 18th Dynasty surgeon. Dr. Charles Finch, a medical doctor who has made a special study on the papyrus, was somewhat baffled by the standards of this medical knowledge achieved. He notes that cases 29 through 33 all represent additional case descriptions of vertebral dislocations and subluxations and their clinical consequences. At present, some of these conditions are almost impossible to detect or describe fully without X-ray studies. The question then arises is how did our ancient surgeon, living and practicing thousands of years ago, manage to diagnose and describe these problems without benefit of X-rays? On the military front, Den successfully campaigned against the people of the Sinai Peninsula. Finally, he innovated in building technique. His tomb had a stela of diorite with floor of red granite. Previously, these stones were only used to make vessels. Political turmoil interrupted the technical and cultural achievements made during the reigns of the last 3 kings of this dynasty. Royal names were erased from inscriptions as a political and magical weapon. This reflected disputes in the royal lineage that prepared the way for a change in the dynasty. As with the First Dynasty, the Second Dynasty rulers originated from the thinnest region. As far as modern historians are concerned, this is an obscure period where little is currently known. What can be deduced, however, is that perhaps 12 rulers held the crown of Egypt from 5386 to 5046 BC. During this period, pottery was turned on a wheel for the first time. Pharaoh Benater, perhaps the 4th king of the dynasty, ruled for 47 years. He is depicted as celebrating the Heb-Sed festival at least once during his reign. This festival rejuvenated the king as the deity Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. Parabisan may well have been the 6th king of his line. Unlike the earlier kings, he was a worshipper of Set, an ancient god of the south. He also restored the old practice of having royal burials in the city of Abydos. Pharaoh Kesakumi, the last king of the dynasty, presided over a brilliant 48 years of political and religious stability. Icons from his period depict both the Horus and Set animals above his name, implying his allegiance to both deities. Stone sculpture developed greatly during this time. Private individuals as well as royalty had portrait sculptures carved. Finally, there is evidence of trade with Byblos in Palestine. Agriculture was, of course, the key economic activity during this period. Taxes were paid to the government in kind, mostly grain and foodstuffs. Collected grain was stored in warehouses, and the surplus paid for royal building and also relief activities. It could be distributed as and when necessary. Surplus food production was also sold into the Middle East. From there, the Egyptians imported wood from Lebanon and Syria, olive oil from Palestine, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The very ancient city of Nekheb, near Hirokinopolis, controlled trade routes to the Red Sea. From here, the Egyptians attained flint, gold, lead, and tin. They spent the wealth generated on lavish monuments based on their ancestralist religious beliefs that buildings for the dead should be more important than those of the living. Sir E. A. Wallace Budge, the venerable English Egyptologist, also alludes to trade between Egypt and the lands to the south in this view. Of the relations which existed between the Nubian sheiks and the Normer and Aha conquerors of Egypt and its earliest dynastic kings, we know nothing, but that intercourse went on between Egypt and Nubia at this period for trading purposes is quite certain. There is a possibility that the people of the Upper Egypt were descendants of settlers from the southeastern parts of Sudan, and Naville and Maspero believed that the Egyptians and the people of Punt belonged to the same race. Punt was a country near Somaliland, and many dynastic Egyptians regarded it as their original home. The long plaited beards of the Egyptian gods resemble those worn by the men of Punt, and certain funerary ceremonies were of Puntanite origin. The Egyptian court was well organized at this time, with the institution of a number of key office holders. The Reverend Baki, a fine historian and most charming wordsmith, explained how this worked. The court chamberlain appears as early as the reign of Narmer, the commander of the Indonesian, who mentioned the reign of Jur, is evidence of the early date at which the Egyptian organized the resources of the state for the purpose of dealing with the life-giving bounty of the Nile. A little later in the dynasty comes the commander of the elders, while in the reign of the king, Mernet, we have the appearance of functionary with whom the Bible stories of our childhood made us familiar. Pharaoh's chief butler, who figures as the keeper of the wine. Still in the first dynasty, we have the royal seal-bearer, the royal architect, and the keeper of the king's vineyards. And the grouping round the king of the regular aristocracy is attested by the names of the leader of the peers and the master of ceremonies. Evidently, Egyptian society had already stiffened into something of the minute ritual of court etiquette which marked it in later days. For purposes of administration, the country was the first provided with two treasuries, one for the north, the Red House, and one for the south, the White House. The kings of the first two dynasties were buried in deep underground tombs lined with bricks. Over these burials stood mud brick structures called mastabas. In time, these buildings became elaborate. Kesakumi built the largest royal tomb in the city of Abydos, shaped like a trapezium. It was 230 feet long and over 33 feet wide. Some distance away is the remains of the king's palace. Its mud bricks undulated and wound into a number of niches and recesses. In its day, it boasted white-paneled walls. In size, it was an awesome 400 feet long and 213 feet wide. Standing 36 feet high, its walls were a staggering 18 feet thick. Kesakumi built another palatial enclosure, this time at Hirokinopolis. Finally, there exists an interesting and important monument built near the city of Memphis, an astounding 1,150 by 2,130 feet with walls 49 feet thick. This structure was probably the world's very first building in stone. Scholars do not as yet know who built this monument, but they have reason to give credit to King Kesakumi. The third dynasty, 5046 to 4872 BC, there was a change in public administration. The prime minister now led the bureaucratic structure. The great ruler of this dynasty was Pharaoh Djoser. During his 29 years, Egyptian power was felt in Lower Nubia and in the Sinai region. In the latter region, Egyptian miners worked the copper and turquoise mines. There were developments in arts. Statues for the first time were made life-sized. Some stone statues were carved for private persons. There were other developments in relief sculpture. As an example of this, the wooden plaques recovered from the tomb of Hezrir were distinguished and showed the artistic development. The city of Saqqara was originally south of Memphis, necropolis. Here, Djoser built a complex that replaced an old temple of wood, brick, and woven mats. Imhotep, his prime minister, designed the building. This structure contained Egypt's first pyramid. The Step Pyramid and its surrounding complex represent major developments in technological achievement and artistic sensibility. The Step Pyramid was built of 6 steps. Its shape represents the primeval mound of creation. It contains chapels of blue tiles that depict the Hebsed festivals. There was also a life-size statue of the king, which Mr. Rice feels deserves to be recognized as one of the wonders of the world. The symbolic meaning behind the construction is that the pharaoh was continually having his vitality renewed and has thus become immortal. Mr. Rice further notes that the Djoser complex is unique. Once again, it is totally without precedent, known merely in Egypt but in the entire world. For centuries, its high white limestone curtain walls and elegant, superbly proportioned kiosks, magazines, and shrines which were built within the walls made it the most remarkable building in the world. Perhaps indeed it remains the most remarkable ever built. The period was not always tranquil and positive, however. There is a famous document called the Famine Stella, associated with Pharaoh Djoser. It describes a famine that lasted 7 years caused by low Nile floods. At the end of the famine, the king offered land to the priests of Khnum of Nubia. They helped to end the famine. Imhotep was an able and praiseworthy figure. Mr. Rice believes it entirely possible that no remarkable creative talent ever lived. He was born in Memphis to a high-born family. Father, Conifer, was a distinguished royal architect and master builder. Under Djoser, Imhotep served as prime minister, but he was also an astronomer, physician, poet, philosopher, and chief lector priest of Heliopolis. As an architect and medical doctor, his reputation was unassailable. By 525 BC, Imhotep was deified. A temple was later dedicated to him in Karnak. King Huni, 4898-4872 BC, was the last monarch of the Third Dynasty. He had 8 smaller step pyramids built across the country. It is possible that these buildings were important for more administration reasons. They may have been used for census collection or tax collection. The 3 Great Pyramids of Giza are perhaps the most visited attraction in the world. The 3 monuments have been attributed to 3 kings of the 4th Dynasty, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura. There are over 90 royal pyramids in Egypt, however. The pyramids themselves symbolize a daily religious meaning. The Egyptians had accounts of creation where creation begins through a primeval watery void called Nun. Out of this void emerged the sun god, considered the embodiment of life, energy, and light. This sun god emerges into the shape of a hill that emerges out of the water, also called Ta. The pyramids represent this shape and thus symbolic of the god Ta. Also built during the 4th dynastic period was the Helwan Dam, a most impressive engineering feat. The dam consisted of stone, rubble, and other walling. It was over 321 feet wide at the bottom and 184 feet across at the top. It was originally designed to be 46 feet high and 361 feet long. It is possible that 500 workmen were employed to build it. The dam demonstrated great hydrological knowledge. The 4th dynasty had its origin in Memphis, or Elephantine, see Chapter 8. Pharaoh Sneferu, its founder, was perhaps the most important builder of the entire Pyramid Age. Ascending the throne in 4872 BC, he ruled for a possible 48 years. During this time, there are records of 40 ships laden with cedar wood arriving from Byblos in the single year. The ships from this period were impressive, being 150 feet long. Their arbors were located in Delta. There are also records of military campaigns. Sneferu marched against Nubia and Libya, seizing prisoners and cattle. From Nubia, he took 7,000 prisoners and 200,000 heads of cattle. From Libya, he brought back 11,000 prisoners and 13,100 heads of cattle. The raids boosted the treasury through tribute and taxation. There was also stone quarrying conducted on large scale. Sneferu built 3 grand pyramids, possibly also 2 smaller ones. He built the pyramid at Medum, the bent pyramid of Dashar, and the red pyramid. Prince Khenefer, his architect, designed these buildings. The mortuary temples consisted of an altar and 2 stelae inscribed with royal titulary. The bent pyramid, by contrast, has statues and wall reliefs. The scenes depicted include foundation rituals, the Hebsed festival, and also the first known examples of the king being embraced by a deity. times, the Egyptians would remember Sneferu as a beneficent ruler that presided over great general prosperity. The ruling class also benefited greatly. Their quality of life can be gauged by the extraordinarily sumptuous elegance of the furnishings found in the tomb of Sneferu's consort queen, Hetepheres. Once more, it is not only their richness of materials and precision of craftsmanship which amazes. It is, overwhelmingly, the certainty and restraint with which they are designed. The hoard of objects from Hetepheres' burial, a fraction of what originally it contained, are amongst the most splendid to survive from the Old Kingdom. What did survive, however, was a magnificent alabaster sarcophagus, a carrying chair exquisitely inlaid with gold, a gold-encased bed, and a gossamer fine canopy, gold implements, and silver bracelets inlaid with butterflies. The houses of this time were typically 1 or 2 stories with front courtyards. The 1-story houses had 3 rooms with a veranda. By contrast, the 2-story houses had 6 rooms, an outside staircase, and a roof loggia. Walls were typically of sun-dried brick with floors of beaten earth. The roofs were usually flat, but there were also domed roofs and barrel-vaulted roofs. Wood was used for columns, ceiling beams, and stair supports. The British historian Dr. Watterson informs us that wood was also used as sort of a damp course. Wooden poles, set at intervals along the upper part of the wall, kept the mud brick dry by allowing moisture to permeate through them until it reached the outside air. The window and door frames were of stone. Sometimes the inhabitants slept on the roof, as it was cooler. They would sometimes erect a parapet of wood and reeds, or also a wooden pavilion for privacy. The rooms typically contained couches, stools, and chests. There were single bed of wooden frames that contained leather or string webbing. The furniture legs were carved to resemble the legs and feet of animals. The houses of the wealthy had stone window gratings. At night, stone or powdery lamps, burning castor oil or animal fat, illuminated the insides. Surrounding these houses were pools and gardens with flower beds. For the royal family, their houses were likely to be even larger, but no evidence of palaces from the Old Kingdom period exists today. On this basis, some authorities conclude that the Egyptians of this period did not have palaces. In 4824 BC, Pharaoh Khufu succeeded Sneferu to the royal throne. He built the first Great Pyramid of Giza. This building, though noteworthy due to its great size, accuracy, and orientation, was no more impressive than the other 2 Giza pyramids. The Great Pyramid complexes of all consisted of a causeway, a valley temple, a mortuary temple, and the pyramids themselves. Surrounding the Great Pyramid were 5 rock-hewn pits that contained boats. One such boat was 143 feet long. The distinguished Egyptologist, Professor Hornung, observed that the immense expenditure entailed was intended not for the glorification of a king, but rather the welfare of the state, which in any case depended on the monarch. His creative powers, which held together the very order of the world, had to be preserved even behind death's door. The construction of the pyramid was thus a communal religious effort on the part of the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom, who were certainly not free in our sense of the world, but rather were in various ways bound to and dependent on the king and the other divine powers. Of the Great Pyramid, Mr. Marshall Adams, an Oxford University historian of 19th century, wrote that the monument in stone is unique, solid almost to indestructibility, incapable of variation, and standing unchanged and unchanging. Regardless of the assaults, whether of time or of a man, the extraordinary pile, the most majestic and most mysterious ever erected by the hand of man, stands close to the verge of the immense desert which stretches its arid wastes across the whole breadth of the African continent to the shore of the Western Ocean, just as the spot where the busy life of the earliest civilization on record was bordered by the vast and barren solitude. Of all the other structures which made the marvels of the ancient world, scarcely a vestige is left. Where are the hanging gardens, the boast of the monarch of Babylon? Where is the far-famed pharaohs of Alexandria? Centuries have passed since earthquake laid low the colossus which bestrode the harbor of Rhodes, and a madman's hand reduced to ashes the temple of Artemis, the pride of Ephesus. But the Grand Pyramid of Giza still remains, undestroyed and indestructible, ages after the lesser marvels have passed away, as it stood ages before ever they came into being. Finally, Khufu built the first temple of Hathor at Denendra. This monument has since been restored several times. Jetefra succeeded Khufu to the throne in 4761 BC. He was the first pharaoh to take the religious title Son of Ra. He began a pyramid at Abu Rawash, but left it incomplete. It is interesting to estimate the population of Egypt during the Pyramid Age. Egypt was primarily an urban civilization. Cities, towns, and ports were dotted along the Nile River. Indeed, the Nile could have been described as one long urban strip. Cities were constructed around temples, craft specialties, graveyards, commercial, and also governmental buildings. And with a population of perhaps 5 million crowded into a habitable area the size of Belgium, writes Professors Oliver and Fagan, two contemporary Africanists. It is clear that Egypt of 2,500 years ago was as urbanized as most modern industrial societies. While it is noted that Oliver and Fagan refer to a much later period in Egyptian history, the importance of their contribution can be judged by comparing it to the following statement by Peter Tompkins, author of the excellent Secrets of the Great Pyramid. Mr. Tompkins specifically addresses the Pyramid Age. Statisticians estimate that 8 million people were crowded into a space of only 11,500 square miles, giving a population density of 695 per square mile, which is more than modern Belgium, the most densely populated part of Europe. Pharaoh Khafra built the second of the Great Pyramids of Giza and also a temple. The temple, built of limestone, consisted of huge granite blocks. Through the doors of this structure were 23 diorite statues of Khafra, all life-sized. Also on the same site was the Great Sphinx. The diorite came from Tushka in Nubia. At this time, the Egyptians controlled these quarries and also the gold mines of Nubia. Menkaure inherited the throne from Khafra in around 4678 BC. He built the third Great Pyramid of Giza. During this time, the different nomes, regions, were allowed greater autonomy from the crown. Each nomarch, regional ruler, claimed that their right to govern came from the protection of local divinity. The nomarches passed on their position to their children. This had the effect of challenging royal power, since the king's ability to appoint the office holders of his choice had now been undermined. Pharaoh Shepseskaf, his successor, broke with recent tradition and raised a mastaba, as opposed to a pyramid. The Fifth Dynasty, 4599 to 4402 BC, had its origins in Elephantine. The kings built important pyramids in the city of Absir, located south of Giza. Though stripped of their casing, these buildings were once important. In 1893, 300 fragments of papyrus were discovered in one of the tombs. An analysis of these fragments revealed that the temples had scribes, priests, and purifiers, as well as members of the local town, drawn from all social classes. The priests had an important role in helping to maintain, transport, and guard the possessions of the pyramid complex. In the mornings and evenings, a sacred ceremony would take place. The people would clean and bathe the statues. At the same time, the priests would chant and fill the place with burning incense. The aim was to prepare the spirit of the dead king for a ritual meal, which would be gradually shared out among the people. Vivian Davies and Renee Friedman, two modern Egyptologists, conclude that this was part of a massive redistribution scheme and one that was highly successful. Pharaoh Userkaf, the founder of the dynasty, ruled for 28 years. During his time, contacts with the international world were widespread. Maintaining international contacts, Pharaoh Sahura, his successor, sent the first fully documented expeditions to Punt, i.e. possibly Somalia or Ethiopia. Trading with Syria, the Egyptians imported Syrian bears for the royal zoo. Furthermore, there were political relations with Crete and also records of a campaign against Libya. Finally, in his mortuary temple, Sahura's artists depict the transportation of his gilded pyramidion. Prime Minister Ptahhotep wrote a famous philosophical text offering practical advice on good conduct in the presence of superiors, inferiors, and equals. It also discusses ethical and social responsibility. His ideas are still timely. If you are a leader, says Ptahhotep, be courteous and listen carefully to the presentations of petitioners. Stop not their speech until they have poured out their heart and spoken that which they came to say. Not all that is asked for can be granted, but a fair hearing satisfies the heart. Inside some of the Fifth Dynasty pyramids are bright and highly colored inscriptions. The walls of the pyramid of Pharaoh Unas, 4435 to 4402 BC, contain the famous pyramid texts. Representing the oldest surviving corpus of religious literature in the world, the text contains spells, religious utterances, and hymns. They were believed to chart the journey of the king into his afterlife. On a practical note, Unas also ordered campaigns. He battled the Asiatic Bedouins of Sinai, or southern Palestine. In 4402 BC, Pharaoh Teti founded the Sixth Dynasty. During his time, the nomarchs became more and more powerful. Some were able to significantly undermine royal authority. Izzi, nomarch of Edifu, and Hekab of Elephantine became very powerful and were later deified. Pharaoh Pepi II, the fifth king of the dynasty, became an important ruler. Inheriting the throne as a young child, he ruled the nation for a lengthy 94 years, the longest of any king in history. In his time, a man called Harkov made 4 important voyages into Central Africa from Elephantine. From the inscriptions in Harkov's tomb, we learn that he brought back a number of foreign goods, including ebony, incense, ivory, oils, and panther skins. He also returned with a person, a pygmy. Very impressed with his voyage, Pepi II, the child king, wrote Harkov saying how keen he was to meet with him. His letter reads as follows: "Come forth to the palace at once. Hurry and bring with you this pygmy whom you brought from the land of the horizon dwellers, who does the dances of the gods. When he goes with you into the ship, place worthy men around him on deck, lest he fall into the water. When he sleeps, surround him with worthy men in his tent. Expect him 10 times a night. My Majesty wishes to see this pygmy more than the gifts of mine lands. Orders have been given to the town mayors and overseers of priests that supplies are to be furnished for you from every storage depot and every temple." Years later, Pepi II became a great conqueror, seizing control of countries to the south such as Wawat, Irtet, and Punt. In later years, however, things fell apart. Pepi's 9 decades on the throne was accompanied by the growth and power of nomarches and the weakening of the central administration. On the domestic front, the early decades of his reign were quiet and uneventful. In later years, the nomarches and priests took advantage of the king's senility to press for greater power and concessions. The king practically gave land away tax-free to the priests. This spelled trouble. Professor Honung offers a fine and incisive analysis on the situation. The decisive factor was that the archaic patriarchal structure of the administration was no longer adequate to meet the more specialized demands of the era, and thus not suited in all respects to the tenor of the times. The increases in the number of cultic endowments freed by royal decree from taxes and other obligations put a strain on the economy of the state. A weak central administration could no longer provide the state-conducted trade with the rational planning or the armed protection it needed. The consequences were economic difficulties and ultimate catastrophe, famine, and struggle for life itself. After Pepi II came Marine II, who ruled for 1 year. Succeeding him was Nitocris, a female pharaoh. She was the last ruler of the dynasty and presided for 12 years. The old kingdom fell in 4188 BC. Kush. The city of Kerma was the heart of the Kushite state. Its authority was felt from the Second Cataract of the Nile down to the Fourth. This city goes back a long way in history. Some authorities claim that it was probably settled as early as the 4th millennium BC. However, as in Egypt, there are clearly problems with the chronology of Kush. Charles Bonnet, an important Swiss archaeologist, believes that there were clear divisions that can be made in Kushite history, basing his ideas on the research of Bridget Gratian. The divisions she proposes are the ancient period of 2500, 2400 to 2050 BC, the middle period of 2050 to 1750 BC, and the classic period of 1750 to 1500 BC. Throughout these periods, Kush was often in political conflict with Egypt. It is unfortunate, however, that Gratian has dated the Kerma artifacts in conformity to the short chronology of Meyer and Breasted. The Meyer-Breasted chronology does not stand up to the critical scrutiny and is therefore likely that the Kerma artifacts are much older than the dates given there. Bonnet believes that the beginning of the ancient Kerma period was contemporaneous with Harkov. Manetho dates this period to 4200 BC. Bonnet believes that the middle period is contemporaneous with the Theban period in Egypt. Manetho gives this as about 3500 BC. Finally, Bonnet gives 1750 BC for the Classic period, but is not at all clear how this date was arrived at. We cannot therefore offer a firm Manetho date for the beginnings of this period. By around 4200 BC, or perhaps earlier, Kerma had emerged as the capital of a unified state. Bonnet believes that it lasted intact for nearly 1,000 years, but we think this is conservative. Tellingly, Bonnet believes that this state may well have been the land of Yam, that was Harkuf's destination in the voyage previously described. Between Kush and Egypt lay another kingdom ruled from the city of Sai. By the Middle Period, beginning in, say, 3450 BC, Kush was a powerful state. Its rulers wore the long white crown of Teseti. Its burial practices may well indicate that their main deity was Amun, as in Egypt at the same period. Its soldiers gained an important reputation for their skills in warfare. They were armed with bows and arrows. Kushite power was indirectly reflected in the massive fortress built by the Egyptian pharaohs of later dynasties to keep the Kushites at bay. In later years, the Kushites pillaged these forts and carried away Egyptian artifacts. The great epic in Kushite history was the Classic period, which began in 1750 BC, according to Bonnet. Kush became a powerful and very large state. They seized control of the Sai kingdom and therefore dominated the whole of the Nubian Nile from the First Cataract. Professor Hansberry, the great African-American historian, informs us of an Egyptian inscription in the city of Waset that names 242 towns, cities, and districts in Kush and also in Punt. Kerma became a great city. At this time, it was the largest city in Africa that lay outside Egyptian territory. At the peak of its power, it covered 65 acres. Surrounding the central parts of the city was a wall of massive sides with a ditch in front of it. The walls were 30 feet high and made of mud bricks. They had rectangular towers that projected and also had 4 fortified gates. Inside the city lay the gardens, the palace of the king, the houses of the nobility, and the Defufa, a large white temple. There was also a second religious complex separated by a 16-foot wall. This complex consisted of bronze workshops, storerooms, housings for priests, and also chapels. Archaeologists working in the city have detected a large audience hall that probably dates from the Middle Period. This building was circular and may have been thatched. Also found were thousands of mud blanks, and that would have been used for making seals. This gives evidence that business transactions took place. There was also a great palace. It had an audience hall that included a throne on a raised platform. The king sat here and received delegations. Several large columns supported the roof, and the building is believed to have been 25 feet high. In its time, the kingdom of Kush controlled gold mines and also major trade routes between Egypt and the rest of Africa. The goods sold in Egypt were incense, ebony, ivory, ostrich eggs, animal skins, and slaves. Kush itself produced high-quality pottery that was eggshell thin. It was the finest ceramics industry produced in the ancient world. They also produced bronze implements of exceptional quality. The kings were buried in huge tombs over 262 feet in diameter. These tombs were filled with luxury products such as jewelry, weaponry, pottery, and inlaid furniture. Some of the products were of Egyptian manufacture, such as vessels and stone sculptures. It seems that the decline of the kingdom of Kush was related to drying up of its water supply. The 2 Nile channels that used to feed the city dried up, and consequently the city went into decline. As will be explained, the final blow came with the rise of Egypt's 18th dynasty, whose destructive campaigns destroyed the city.